Fireside Tales for Wolfgang. Episode 35. Greetings and salutations. I'm Hunter Ackerman, here to read some classic literature for you. Someone asked me at the beginning of August if I like to think about silly things and just let my mind wander. Now, the context that she was asking was in regards to astrology. Because she said with a simple disclaimer, I don't really believe it. I don't really take it seriously. I just like to, it's just kind of fun to let my mind wander through and see all the things that seem to apply. And I was a little taken aback. And as I put my finger on why I was slightly taken aback, it's because one of the things that I like to do personally is be as aware as possible of my own observation biases. I collect observation biases the way some people collect stamps. Because where I am aware of my own observation biases, those are places that I must look closer in order to disabuse myself of as many false beliefs as possible and embrace as many true things, discernibly true things, as possible. And do I have silly things that I like to let my mind wander around like that? And I don't know if this qualifies as a silly thing, but one of the things that I love to think about, because of the sheer stretch of imagination that it requires, is something called the Fermi paradox. So there was an Italian physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project. A little refresher on the United States history: the Manhattan Project was when in the early 40s we were working on atomic weapons. And Einstein would not participate, but the people, at least in the United States, who did participate, most of them were participating on the basis that if we don't get this, the Germans will. I don't know if they knew about the Holocaust yet, but they did know that Hitler was not the sort of dude that you want to have wielding the first atomic weapons. But back to the Fermi paradox. Enrico Fermi was an Italian physicist who was on our side, working with Americans, and on the Manhattan Project. And he basically asked this very simple question, looking up into the night sky, hypothetically, and said, if the universe is so friendly and conducive to life, where is everybody else? Now, the funny thing about the Fermi paradox is that Fermi didn't think of it as a paradox at all. Fermi seems to have thought it was kind of an obvious question because space is so unimaginably big that if we live at the same time as another civilization, it's so damn far away we can't see each other, we can't talk to each other, we can't even know the other is it. our galaxy alone, this is just our galaxy is about 100,000 light years across. So from one spiral arm to from one edge of the Milky Way to the other edge of the Milky Way, it takes light 100,000 years just across. So if there are other alien civilizations existing at the same time as us, and if we had something like a telescope that was powerful enough to see them, we would be seeing them 100,000 years ago and can't even send out a message like, hi, and expect that to get them to them in any time that they can respond and send a hi back sort of message, right? Now, that's just how big space is. Never mind also how deep time in our universe is. So, as staggeringly large as space is, it's even bigger in terms of age. So even if another civilization lived somewhere in our area of the same galaxy where some kind of communication would be feasible because they're that close, the chances that we're alive at the same time are astronomical. I mean, this is literally where we got the word astronomical. This is, right? And then the third thing that Fermi was thinking of is that life is probably, as a phenomenon, so extraordinarily unlikely, rare, maybe even singular, that he wasn't suggesting this to be a paradox at all. But what I personally like to do a lot, and have for several years, is just imagine answers to that question. If there are other life forms out there, why don't we see them? Why do we hear from them? There are some really obvious answers. There are some answers that require a lot of thought. But the reason that I like to let my imagination run wild with this is because I like to imagine possible solutions to the Fermi paradox that are within the bounds of physical possibility, that which does not outrage logic and confound reason, that which does not defy physics, that which is physically allowable, and yet we still don't see or hear anyone. Why? I've got this book about 8 feet from me called 75 Solutions to the Fermi Paradox. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful book. You are listening to Fireside Tailes for Wolfgang, originally broadcast on GWC Productions' YouTube channel, Caps Media Television Channel 6 in Ventura, on KPPQ LP Ventura at 104.1 FM, and on the KPPQ Podcast Network. Episodes can also be viewed on Pasadena Media. The protagonist of short story, his name is Martin Stoner, so insert giggles and jokes here. I like this story. I think I read this for the first time probably last winter sometime. This is called The Hounds of Fate by H.H. Munro, whose pseudonym was Saki. In the fading light of a close, dull autumn afternoon, Martin Stoner, plodding his way along muddy lanes and rut-seamed cart tracks that led he knew not exactly where, somewhere in front of him, he fancied, lay the sea. And towards the sea his footsteps seemed persistently turning. Why he was struggling wearily forward to that goal, he could scarcely have explained. In his case, the hounds of fate were certainly pressing him with unrelenting insistence. Hunger, fatigue, despairing hopelessness had numbed his brain, and he could scarcely summon sufficient energy to wonder what underlying impulse was driving him onward. Stoner was one of those unfortunate individuals who seemed to have tried everything. A natural slothfulness and improvidence had always intervened to blight any chance of even moderate success, and now he was at the end of his tether, and there was nothing more to try. Desperation had not awakened in him any dormant reserve of energy. On the contrary, a mental torpor grew up around the crisis of his fortunes. With the clothes he stood up in, a half-penny in his pocket, and no single friend or acquaintance to turn to, with no prospect either of a bed for the night or a meal for the morrow, Martin Stoner trudged stolidly forward between the moist hedgerows, and beneath dripping trees, his mind almost a blank, except that he was subconsciously aware that somewhere in front of him lay the sea. Another consciousness obtruded itself now and then, the knowledge that he was miserably hungry. Presently, he came to a halt by an open gateway that led into a spacious and rather neglected farm garden. There was little sign of life about, and the farmhouse at the further end of the garden looked chill and inhospitable. A drizzling rain, however, was settling in, and Stoner thought that here perhaps he might obtain a few minutes' shelter and buy a glass of milk with his last remaining coin. He turned slowly and wearily into the garden and followed a narrow, flagged path up to a side door. Before he had time to knock, the door opened and a bent, withered-looking old man stood aside in the doorway, as though to let him pass in. "Hello? Could I come in out of the rain?" Stoner began, but the old man interrupted him. "Come on in, Master Tom. I knew you'd come back one of these days." Stoner lurched across the threshold and stood staring uncomprehendingly at the other. "Right, sit down while I put you out a bit of supper," said the old man with quavering eagerness. Stoner's legs gave way from very weariness, and he sank inertly into the armchair that had been pushed up to him. In another minute, he was devouring the cold meat, cheese, and bread that had been placed on the table at his side. "You little changed these last 4 years," went on the old man, in a voice that sounded to Stoner as something in a dream, far away and rather inconsequent. "But you'll find us a deal changed, you will. As no one about the place, same as when you left, not but me and your old auntie. I'll go and tell her you come. She won't be seeing you, but she'll let you stay right enough. She always did say if you was to come back, that you should stay, but she'd never set eyes on you or speak to you again." The old man placed a mug of beer on the table in front of Stoner, and then hobbled away down a long passage. The drizzle of rain had changed to a furious lashing downpour which beat violently against the door and windows. The wanderer thought with a shudder of what the seashore must look like under this drenching rainfall, with night beating down on all sides. He finished the food and beer and sat numbly waiting for the return of his strange host. As the minutes ticked by, a new hope began to flicker and grow in the young man's mind. The expansion of his former craving for food and rest had grown into a longing to find a night's shelter under the seemingly hospitable roof. A clattering of footsteps down the passage heralded the old farm servant's return. "Right, so the old missus won't see you, Master Tom, but she says you are to stay. 'Tis right enough, seeing the farm will be yours when she be put under the earth. I've had a fire lit in your room, Master Tom, and the maids has put fresh sheets onto the bed. You'll find naught changed up there. Maybe you're tired and you'd like to go there now? Without a word, Martin Stoner rose heavily to his feet and followed his ministering angel along a passage, up a short creaking stair, along another passage, and into a large room lit with a cheerfully blazing fire. There was but little furniture, plain, old-fashioned, and good of its kind. A stuffed squirrel in a case and a wall calendar of 4 years ago were the only symptoms of decoration. But Stoner had eyes for little else than the bed and could scarce wait to tear his clothes off of him before rolling in a luxury of weariness into its comfortable depths. The hounds of fate seemed to have checked for a brief moment. In the cold light of morning, Stoner laughed mirthlessly as he slowly realized the position in which he found himself. Perhaps he might snatch a bit of breakfast on the strength of his likeliness to this other missing ne'er-do-well and get safely away before anyone discovered the fraud that had been thrust on him. In the room downstairs, he found the bent old man ready with a dish of bacon and fried eggs for Master Tom's breakfast, while a hard-faced, elderly maid brought in a teapot and poured him out a cup of tea. As he sat at the table, a small spaniel came up and made friendly advances. "This is old Boker's pup," explained the old man, whom the hard-faced maid had addressed as George. "She was main fond of you. Never seemed the same after you went away to Australia. She died about a year ago. This is a pup." Stoner found it difficult to regret her decease. As a witness for identification, she would have left something to be desired. "You want to go for a ride, Master Tom?" was the next startling proposition that came from the old man. "We got a nice little roan cob that goes well in the saddle. Old Biddy's getting a bit up in years, though. She goes well still, but I'll have the little roan saddled and brought round to the door." "Well, I've got no riding things," stammered the castaway, almost laughing as he looked down at his one suit of well-worn clothes. "Master Tom," said the old man earnestly, almost with an offended air, "all your things is just as you left 'em. A bit of airing before the fire and they'll be all right. 'Twill be a bit of a distraction, like a little riding and wild fowling now and again. You'll find the folk round here is hard and bitter minds towards you. They hasn't forgotten nor forgiven. No one will come nigh you, so you'd best get what distraction you can with horse and dog. They're good company, too." Old George hobbled away to give his orders, and Stoner, feeling more than ever like one in a dream, went upstairs to inspect Master Tom's wardrobe. A ride was one of the pleasures dearest to his heart, and there was some protection against immediate discovery of his impostrature and the thought that none of Tom's aforetime companions were likely to favor him with a close inspection. As the interloper thrust himself into some tolerably well-fitting riding cords, he wondered vaguely what manner of misdeed the genuine Tom had committed to set the whole countryside against him. The thud of quick, eager hoofs on damp earth cut short his speculations. The roan cob had been brought up to the side door. Right. Talk of beggars on horseback, thought Stoner to himself as he trotted rapidly along the muddy lanes where he had tramped yesterday as a down-at-heel outcast. And then he flung reflection indolently aside and gave himself up to the pleasure of a smart canter along the turf-grown side of a level stretch of road. At an open gateway, he checked his pace to allow 2 carts to turn into a field. The lads driving the carts found time to give him a prolonged stare. And as he Passed on, he heard an excited voice call out, "Right, it's Tom Pike. I knowed him once. Show him himself again here, is he?" Evidently, the likeness which had imposed at close quarters on a doddering old man was good enough to mislead younger eyes at medium distances. In the course of his ride, he met with ample evidence to confirm the statement that local folk had neither forgotten nor forgiven the bygone crime which had come to him as a legacy from the absent Tom. Scowling looks, mutterings, and nudgings greeted him wherever he chanced upon human beings. Boker's pup, trotting placidly by his side, seemed the one element of friendliness in a hostile world. As he dismounted at the side door, he caught a fleeting glimpse of a gaunt, elderly woman peering at him from behind the curtain of an upper window. Evidently, this was his aunt by adoption. Over the ample midday meal that stood in readiness for him, Stoner was able to review the possibilities of his extraordinary situation. The real Tom, after 4 years of absence, might suddenly turn up at the farm, or a letter might come from him at any moment. Again, in the character of heir to the farm, the false Tom might be called on to sign documents, which would be an embarrassing predicament of mismatched handwriting. Or a relative might arrive who would not imitate the aunt's attitude of aloofness. All these things would mean ignominious exposure. On the other hand, the alternative was the open sky and the muddy lanes that led down to the sea. The farm offered him, at any rate, a temporary refuge from destitution. Farming was one of the many things he had tried, and he would be able to do a certain amount of work in return for the hospitality to which he was so desperately little entitled. "Will you have cold pork for your supper?" asked the hard-faced maid as she cleared the table. "Or will you have it hotted up?" "Hot, with onions," said Stoner. It was the only time in his life that he had made a rapid decision, and as he gave the order, he knew that he meant to stay. Stoner kept rigidly to those portions of the house which seems to have been allotted to him by a tacit treaty of delimitation. When he took part in the farm work, it was as one who worked under orders and never initiated them. Old George, the roan cob, and Boker's pup were his sole companions in a world that was otherwise frostily silent and hostile. Of the mistress of the farm, he saw nothing. Once, when he knew she had gone forth to church, he made a furtive visit to the farm parlor in an endeavor to glean some fragmentary knowledge of the young man whose place he had usurped and whose ill repute he had fastened onto himself. There were many photographs hung on the walls or stuck in prim frames, but the likeness he sought for was not among them. At last, in an album thrust out of sight, he came across what he wanted. There was a whole series labeled Tom. A podgy child of 3, in a fantastic frock, an awkward boy of about 12 holding a cricket bat as though he loathed it, a rather good-looking youth of 18 with very smooth, evenly parted hair, and finally, a young man with a somewhat surly, daredevil expression. At this last portrait, Stoner looked with particular interest. The likeness to himself was unmistakable. From the lips of old George, who was garrulous enough on most subjects, he tried again and again to learn something of the nature of the offense which shut him off as a creature to be shunned and hated by his fellow men. So, what do the folk around here say about me? He asked one day as they were walking home from an outlying field. The old man shook his head. Well, they're all bitter against you. Simple but true. They're mortally bitter. Aye, 'tis a sad business. Sad, sad, sad business. And never could he be got to say anything more enlightening than that. On a clear, frosty evening, a few days before the festival of Christmas, Stoner stood in a corner of the orchard which commanded a wide view of the countryside. Here and there, he could see the twinkling dots of lamps or candle glow which told of human homes where the goodwill and jollity of the season held their sway. Behind him lay the grim, silent farmhouse where no one ever laughed, where even a quarrel would have seemed cheerful. As he turned to look at the long gray front of the gloom-shadowed building, a door opened and old George came hurriedly forth. Stoner heard his adopted name called in a tone of strained anxiety. Instantly, he knew that something untoward had happened, and with a quick revulsion of outlook, his sanctuary became a place of peace and contentment from which he dreaded to be driven. Master Tom, said the old man in a hoarse whisper, you must slip away quiet from here for a few days at least. Michael Lay is back in the village, and he swears to shoot you if he can come across you. And he'll do it too. There's murder in the look of him. Get away under the cover of night. It's only for a week or so. He won't be here longer. But where am I to go? Stammered Stoner, who had caught the infection of the old man's obvious terror. Go right away along the coast to Punchford and keep hid there. When Michael's safe gone, I'll ride the roan over to the Green Dragon at Punchford, and when you see the cob stabled at the Green Dragon, 'tis a sign that you may come back again. But, began Stoner hesitatingly. 'Tis all right for the money, said the other. The old missus agrees. You best do as I say, and she's given me this. The old man produced 3 sovereigns and some odd silver. Stoner felt more of a cheat than ever as he stole away that night from the back gate of the farm with the old woman's money in his pocket. Old George and Boker's pup stood watching him with a silent farewell from the yard. He could scarcely fancy that he would ever come back, and he felt a throb of compunction for those 2 humble friends who would wait wistfully for his return. Someday, perhaps, the real Tom would come back, and there would be wild wonderment among those simple farm folks as to the identity of the shadowy guest that they had harbored under their roof. For his own fate, he felt no immediate anxiety. 3 pounds sterling goes but little way in the world when there's nothing behind it. But to a man who has counted his exchequer in pennies, it seems a good starting point. Fortune had done him a whimsically kind turn when he trod these lanes as a hopeless adventurer, and there might be yet a chance of his finding some work and making a fresh start. As he got further from the farm, his spirits rose higher. There was a sense of relief in regaining once more his lost identity and ceasing to be the uneasy ghost of another. He scarcely bothered to speculate about the implacable enemy who had dropped from nowhere into his life, since that life was now behind him. One unreal item the more made little difference. For the first time in many months, he began to hum a careless, light-hearted refrain. Then there stepped out from the shadow of an overhanging oak tree a man with a gun. There was no need to wonder who he might be. The moonlight falling on his white-set face revealed a glare of human hate such as Stoner, in the ups and downs of his wanderings, had never seen before. He sprang aside in a wild effort to break through the hedge that bordered the lane, but the tough branches held him fast. The hounds of fate had waited for him in those narrow lanes. And this time, they were not to be denied. Here's a funny little fact. If ever I'm feeling any kind of down or like, oh, poor me, for whatever reason, we all do that from time to time, obviously, right? I was talking to an anthropologist a couple of years ago who dropped a little fact that just stunned me. She said, only 1 in 3 people on the face of the earth have access to a flushing toilet. I mean, that should be mind-blowing. If you just take a moment to parse all the places in Africa, all the places in like rural China, hell, maybe a lot of places in mainland China. It's just all the places all over the world, really. This is distributed amongst a global population, this little fact. Only 1 in 3 people have access to a flushing toilet. And I guess what's mind-blowing is that I have my own toilet, right? I mean, from like a global scale of like how good or bad do you have it? How much better would you like it? Do you have a toilet? Because if the answer is yes, you're doing better than most people. Yeah, it puts a lot of things in perspective. I mean, not only just from the obvious comfort level and that which is included in the privacy of having access to a flushing toilet, but just from a perspective of hygiene and life expectancy. This is one of the things that I understand Bill Gates is actively involved in Africa, is bringing more flushing toilet systems to far-reaching third world countries sort of conditions. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, in just trying to make the world a better place and prevent the spread of disease and raise the quality of life, raise the life expectancy amongst as many human beings as they can positively impact. Like, one of the things that they're doing is coming up with flushable toilet systems. This story is called The Green Door by O. Henry. Suppose you should be walking down Broadway after dinner with 10 minutes allotted to the consummation of your cigar while you're choosing between a diverting tragedy and something serious in the way of vaudeville. Suddenly, a hand is laid upon your arm. You turn to look into the thrilling eyes of a beautiful woman. She's just wonderful in diamonds and Russian sables. She thrusts hurriedly into your hand an extremely hot buttered roll, flashes out a tiny pair of scissors, snips off the second button from your overcoat, meaningly shouts the one-word parallelogram, and swiftly flies down a cross street, looking back fearfully over her shoulder. That would be pure adventure. Would you accept it? Probably my favorite single aspect of Burning Man, by the way. That would be pure adventure. Would you accept it? No, not you. You would flush with embarrassment. You would sheepishly drop the roll and continue down Broadway, fumbling feebly for the missing button. This you would do unless you were one of the blessed few in whom the spirit of pure adventure is not dead. True adventurers have never been plentiful. They who are set down in print as such have been mostly businessmen with the newly invented methods. They've been out for the things they wanted: golden fleeces, holy grails, lady loves, treasure, crowns, fame. The true adventurer goes forth aimless and uncalculating to meet and greet unknown fate. A fine example was the prodigal son when he started back home. Half-adventurers, brave and splendid figures, have been numerous, from the Crusades to the Palisades. They've enriched the arts of history and fiction and the trade of historical fiction. But each of them had a prize to win, a goal to kick, an axe to grind, a race to run, a new thrust in a fencing parrying position to deliver, a name to carve, a grievance to adjust. So they were not followers of true adventure. In the big city, the twin spirits, romance and adventure, are always abroad, seeking worthy wooers. As we roam the streets, they slyly peep at us and challenge us in 20 different guises. Without knowing why, we look up suddenly to see a face in the window that seems to belong to our gallery of intimate portraits. In a sleeping thoroughfare, we hear a cry of agony and of fear coming from an empty and shuttered house. Instead of at our familiar curb, a cab driver deposits us before a strange door, and this door seems to smile, opens for us, and bids us enter. A slip of paper written upon flutters down to our feet from the high lattices of chance. We exchange glances of instantaneous hate, affection, and fear with hurrying strangers in the passing crowds. A sudden douse of rain, and our umbrella may be sheltering the daughter of the full moon and the first cousin of the king of nowhere. At every corner, handkerchiefs drop. Fingers beckon. Eyes besiege. And the lost, the lonely, the rapturous, the mysterious, the perilous. All those changing clues of adventure are slipped into our fingers, but few of us are willing to hold and follow them. We are grown stiff with the ramrod of convention down our backs. We continue on, and someday we come at the end of a very dull life to reflect that our romance has been a pallid thing of a marriage or two, a satin rosette kept in a safe deposit drawer, and a lifelong feud with a steam radiator. Rudolf Steiner was a true adventurer. Few were the evenings on which he did not go forth from his hall bedchamber in search of the unexpected and the egregious. The most interesting thing in life seemed to him to be what might lie just around the next corner. Sometimes his willingness to tempt fate led him into strange paths. Twice he had spent the night in a station house. Again and again he had found himself the dupe of ingenious and mercenary tricksters. His watch and money had been the price of one flattering allurement, but with undiminished ardor he picked up every glove cast before him into the merry lists of adventure. One evening, Rudolph was strolling along a cross-town street in the older central part of the city. Two streams of people filled the sidewalks, the home hurrying and that restless contingent that abandons home for the specious welcome of the 1,000-candle power of a restaurant. The young adventurer was of pleasing presence and moved serenely and watchfully. By daylight, he was a salesman in a piano store. He wore his tie drawn through a topaz ring instead of fastened with a stick pin, and once he had written to the editor of a magazine that Junie's Love Test by Miss Libby had been the book that had most influenced his life. Sidebar. Miss Libby, her fiction provided a formula for female escape literature. It preached a simple message. A young girl who remains virginal, can ultimately expect to secure not only a husband and happiness, but a fortune, too. Kind of like an advice column of the day, but more fictional in its approach. During his walk, a violent chattering of teeth in a glass case on the sidewalk seemed at first to draw his attention, with a qualm, to a restaurant before which it was set, but a second glance revealed the electric letters of a dentist's sign high above the next door. A giant black man, fantastically dressed in a red embroidered coat, yellow trousers, and a military cap, discreetly distributed cards to those of the passing crowd who consented to take them. This mode of advertising was a common sight to Rudolph. Usually he passed the dispenser of the dentist's cards without taking any, but tonight the African slipped one into his hand so deftly that he held it there, smiling a little at the successful feat. When he had traveled a few yards further, he glanced at the card indifferently. Surprised, he turned it over and looked again with interest. One side of the card was blank. On the other was written in ink 3 words: "The Green Door." And then Rudolph saw, 3 steps in front of him, a man throw down the card the African had given him as he passed. Rudolph picked it up. It was printed with the dentist's name and address and the usual schedule of plate work and bridge work and crowns and specious promises of painless operations. The adventurous piano salesman halted at the corner and considered. Then he crossed the street, walked down a block, recrossed, and joined the upward current of people again. Without seeming to notice the black man as he passed the second time, he carelessly took the card that was handed him. 10 steps away, he inspected it. In the same handwriting that appeared on the first card, "The Green Door" was inscribed upon it. 3 or 4 cards were tossed to the pavement by pedestrians, both in front and behind him. These fell blank side up. Rudolph turned them over. Every one bore the printed legend of the dental parlors. Rarely did the arch sprite adventure need to beckon twice to Rudolph Steiner, his true follower, but twice it had been done, and the quest was on. Rudolph walked slowly back to where the giant African stood by the case of rattling teeth. This time, as he passed, he received no card. In spite of his gaudy and ridiculous garb, the Ethiopian displayed a natural dignity as he stood, offering the cards suavely to some, allowing others to pass with no attention. Every half-minute, he chanted a harsh, unintelligible phrase akin to the jabber of car conductors and a grand opera, and not only did he withhold a card this time, but it seemed to Rudolph that he received from the shining and massive black countenance a look of cold, almost contemptuous disdain. The look stung the adventurer. He read it in a silent accusation that he, Rudolph, had been found wanting in some way. Whatever the mysterious written words on the cards might mean, the black man had selected him twice from the throng for their recipient, and now seems to have condemned him as deficient in the wit and spirit to engage the enigma. Standing aside from the rush, the young man made a rapid estimate of the building in which he conceived that his adventure must lie. 5 stories high it rose. A small restaurant occupied the basement. The first floor, now closed, seemed to house millinery or furs. The second floor, by the winking electric letters, was the dentist's. Above this, a polyglot babel of signs struggled to indicate the abodes of palmacists, dressmakers, musicians, and doctors. Still higher up, draped curtains and milk bottles on the windowsills proclaimed the regions of domesticity. After concluding his survey, Rudolph walked briskly up the high flight of stone steps into the house. Up 2 flights of the carpeted stairway, he continued, and at its top, he paused. The hallway there was dimly lighted by 2 pale jets of gas, one far to his right, the other nearer to his left. He looked toward the nearer light and saw within its wan halo a green door. For one moment he hesitated. Then he seemed to see the contumelious sneer of the African man of cards, and then he walked straight up to the green door and knocked upon it. Moments like those that passed before his knock was answered measure the quick breath of the true adventurer. What might not be behind those green panels? Gamesters at play, cunning rogues baiting their traps with subtle skill, beauty in love with courage, and thus planning to be sought by it, danger, death, love, disappointment, ridicule, any of these might respond to that reckless rap. A faint rustle was heard inside, and the door slowly opened. A girl not yet 20 stood there, white-faced and tottering. She loosed the knob and swayed weakly, groping with one hand. Rudolph caught her and laid her on a faded couch that stood against the wall. He closed the door and took a swift glance around the room by the light of a flickering gas jet. Neat but extreme poverty was the story that he read. The girl lay still, as if in a faint. Rudolph looked around the room excitedly for a barrel. People must be rolled upon a barrel who... No. That was for drowned persons. He began to fan her with his hat. That was successful, for he struck her nose with the brim of his derby, and she opened her eyes. And then the young man saw that hers, indeed, was the one missing face from his heart's gallery of intimate portraits. The frank gray eyes, the little nose turning pertly outward, the chestnut hair curling like the tendrils of a pea vine, seemed the right end and reward of all of his wonderful adventures. But the face was woefully thin and pale. The girl looked at him calmly and then smiled. "Fainted, didn't I?" she asked weakly. "Well, who wouldn't? You trying to go without anything to eat for 3 days and see?" Himmel! exclaimed Rudolph, jumping up. "Wait till I come back." He dashed out the green door and down the stairs. In 20 minutes, he was back again, kicking at the door with his toe for her to open it. With both arms, he hugged an array of wares from the grocery and the restaurant. On the table, he laid them all: bread and butter, cold meats, cakes, pies, pickles, oysters, a roasted chicken, a bottle of milk, and one of red-hot tea. "This is ridiculous," said Rudolph blusteringly, to go without eating. "You must quit making election bets of this kind. Supper is ready." He helped her to a chair at the table and asked, "Is there a cup for the tea?" "Oh, it's on the shelf by the window," she answered. When he turned again, with the cup, he saw her, with eyes shining rapturously, beginning upon a huge dill pickle that she had rooted out from the paper bags with a woman's unerring instinct. He took it from her laughingly, poured the cup full of milk. "Drink that first," he ordered, "and then you shall have some tea, and then a chicken wing. If you are very good, you shall have a pickle tomorrow, and now, if you'll allow me to be your guest, we'll have supper together." He drew up the other chair. The tea brightened the girl's eyes and brought back some of her color. She began to eat with a sort of dainty ferocity, like some starved wild animal. She seemed to regard the young man's presence and the aid he had rendered her as a natural thing, not as though she undervalued the conventions, but as one whose great stress gave her the right to put aside the artificial for the human. But gradually, with the return of strength and comfort, came also a sense of the little conventions that belong. And she began to tell him her little story. It was one of 1,000 such as the city yawns at every day. The shop girl's story of insufficient wages, further reduced by fines from the shop that go to swell the store's profits, of time lost through illness, and then of lost positions, lost hope, and the knock of the adventurer upon her green door. But to Rudolph, the history sounded as big as the Iliad or the crisis in Junie's love test. "To think of going through all that," he exclaimed. "It was something fierce," said the girl, solemnly. "And you have no relatives or friends in the city?" "None whatever. I'm all alone in the world, too," said Rudolph, after a pause. "I'm glad of that," said the girl promptly, and somehow it pleased the young man to hear that she approved of his bereft condition. Very suddenly, her eyelids dropped and she sighed deeply. "I'm awfully sleepy," she said, "and I feel so good." Then Rudolph rose and took his hat. "I'll say good night. A long night's sleep will be fine for you." He held out his hand, and she took it and said, "Good night." But her eyes asked a question so eloquently, so frankly and pathetically, that he answered it with words. "Oh, I'm coming back tomorrow. Yeah, I'll come by to see how you're getting along. You can't get rid of me so easily." Then, at the door, as though the way of his coming had been so much less important than the fact that he had come, she asked, "How did you know to knock at my door?" He looked at her for a moment, remembering the cards, and felt a sudden jealous pain. What if they had fallen into other hands as adventurous as his? Quickly, he decided that she must never know the truth. He would never let her know that he was aware of the strange expedient to which she had been driven by her great distress. One of our piano tuners lives in this house, he said. I knocked at your door by mistake. The last thing he saw in the room before the green door closed was her smile. At the head of the stairway, he paused and looked curiously about him. And then he went along the hallway to its other end and, coming back, ascended to the floor above and continued his puzzled explorations. Every door that he found in the entire house was painted green. Wondering, he descended to the sidewalk. The fantastic African was still there. Rudolph confronted him with his 2 cards in his hands. "Will you tell me why you gave me these cards and what they mean?" he asked. In a broad, good-natured grin, the black man exhibited a splendid advertisement of his employer's profession. "There it is," he said, pointing down the street. "But I expect you are a little late for the first act." Looking the way he pointed, Rudolph saw above the entrance to a theater the blazing electric sign of its new play, The Green Door. "I'm informed that it's a first-rate show, sir," said the African. "The agent that represents it presented me with $1, sir, to distribute a few of his cards along with doctors. May I offer you one of the doctor's cards, sir?" At the corner of the block in which he lived, Rudolph stopped for a glass of beer and a cigar. When he had come out with his lighted weed, he buttoned his coat, pushed back his hat, and said stoutly to the lamppost on the corner, "All the same, I believe it was the hand of fate that mapped out the way for me to find her." Which conclusion, under the circumstances, certainly admits Rudolf Steiner to the ranks of the true followers of romance and adventure. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Fireside Tales for Wolfgang. To view more of my work, check out my YouTube channel at Hunter's Acoustic Cabin. Directed by Hunter Ackerman. Produced by GWC Productions. The show is dedicated to the memory of my best friend, Wolfgang Beastly. Originally broadcast on GWC Productions' YouTube channel, Caps Media Television Channel 6 in Ventura, on KPPQ LP Ventura at 104.1 FM, and on the KPPQ Podcast Network. Episodes can also be viewed on Pasadena Media, either on Spectrum Charter Channel 32 or on AT&T Uverse Channel 99